Hello, my name is Lisa Pennington. I'm the Governor General of the Mayflower Society. Today we're going to talk about the way the Pilgrims lived 400 years ago. What were the things they valued? What were the things they needed? And what were the things they left behind? One of the most important things we find in every estate is a bed. And in fact, in some of the rooms, the only item of furniture in that room, let's say the downstairs parlor or the upper chamber, will be a bed. But this was probably the most important item of furniture, and in some cases, a whole family would just sleep in one bed. And that might be mom and dad and the 4 kids. Almost every Pilgrim family had one of these great chests. These might have been some of the chests that came on the Mayflower. You could use this as a table, you could use it as a bed, you could use it for storage, for items like this beautiful blanket here, which would have been necessary for all those cold winters. Now I'm before what is called a court cupboard. An unusual piece of furniture that you really don't see very much today. This one is dated from 1670 and has been passed down in the Brewster family before it was donated to the Mayflower Society. And it is one of the most prestigious pieces of furniture that you would have in your house. They might even be as large as 2 or 3 times this size. And they would be beautifully carved like this. They would have a top part of it, and it would also have almost like a chest of drawers part down here. And you would keep, this would be for storage for some of your kitchen items or your china. On the top would be a cloth, and then pieces of pewter or other items that were very prestigious that you wanted your company to know about. Now, one of the most interesting things in these wills is the amount of clothing or lack thereof listed in each of the wills. Items of clothing were very valuable. They were hard to come by. Many of them had to be made in England, so you would pass them down to your children. And it's interesting to see somebody like William Bradford. He had quite a few suits of clothes, including one that was violet. Can you imagine William Bradford in a purple suit? So there would have been, you would have passed down your clothes, and also your linen. Edward Winslow left his linen that he was taking on a voyage to his daughter, and that's what she inherited. Well, sadly, he died at sea, and I always wondered, did she ever get that linen? Here we have stockings that were handmade, and these are incredibly warm, made from the wool of the Pilgrim's sheep. And Francis Cook, astonishingly, had 10 pair of them. So every time I think of Francis Cook, I think of his 10 pair of stockings and how lucky somebody was to get them. This is one of the essentials for every man and mostly every woman, and it's a beaver hat. It's made out of the felt of a beaver skin. Beaver felt and beaver skins were some of the most important things in the Plymouth colony. They were part of the essential economy here, and they traded with Native Americans for those beaver skins. And interestingly, in Mary Ring's will, she makes a point of the fact that she's leaving her beaver skins to her family, but she knows that Mr. Winslow owes her another one. So be sure and get that beaver skin from him. And what these beaver skins, what happened to them was they would be shipped to England. The fur would be taken off and felt would be made for a very warm hat. Not only were they fashionable, but they were very, very warm in a climate like this. Almost every house left a brass kettle. This one comes down in my family at least through my great-great-grandparents and probably even earlier. They would be fit over a hook in your fireplace. You'd be able to cook your stews or your porridge. And the fact that it is handmade and that it hasn't changed in I don't know how many 100 years shows the utility of these kettles. Damask napkins, you see them a lot in the inventories. And I'll show you an example of one. Would have been much larger than this, but a damask napkin is actually at Pilgrim Hall and was brought over by Richard Warren. And it is a beautiful napkin which has a scene of Amsterdam in it. And you can almost picture Elizabeth Warren handing the napkin to her husband as he gets on the voyage, wondering if they'd ever see each other again. Well, they did. She came over a few years later with her 5 girls. They had 2 more boys, and they had lots of napkins after that. In Isaac Allerton's inventory is something called a turkey-worked carpet, and these were some of the most high prestige items that he would have acquired as a merchant overseas. They actually were made in Turkey or the Middle East, and they were heavily traded. If you've ever seen any of Vermeer paintings of the early 1600s that are at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, all of Vermeer's paintings seem to have a turkey-worked carpet, and it's always on the table, never on the floor. Much too prestigious to have it on the floor. Now, some of the other wealthier members of the Pilgrims at the end of their life was little Mary Chilton. In her will, she left silver bowls and 6 silver cups and lots of silver spoons. She'd also married John Winslow, and he was a wealthy merchant, and they actually ended up spending most of their life in Boston. But she came a far way from just being a 13-year-old orphan in 1621. She did quite well. If Governor Bradford was here, he would want to sit in this chair. This is said to be one of his authentic leather chairs. He has about 4 or 5 of them in his will. And the reason why they're called leather chairs is because of the leather cushion here. It's a beautifully carved chair. We know there is also one in Pilgrim Hall and a Brewster chair that is also there, that is also found in the will. We know William Bradford had a lot of books, and lots of the Pilgrims, including the women, had books of their own. But William Brewster takes the cake. He had, in his will, 390 books, probably the most books of any person in the Western Hemisphere. But this is an amazing thing, that some of these books that belong to William Brewster still exist, and they're in various museums in various places. Here we have a cradle. One cradle that was actually in the inventory of Peter Brown and his family. He had in 1633 a new baby, and that's probably why he had a cradle. But one of the sad things that happened in 1633 was an epidemic which hit Plymouth, and a lot of the Mayflower Pilgrims passed away. Dr. Samuel Fuller passed away and left a cow to the meeting house. And in addition, Francis Eaton and Peter Brown passed away. And poor Francis Eaton, he was a carpenter, but he only left 1 table and 1 chair. And he had a wife and 4 children. And Peter Brown had a wife and 4 children. And both of their estates were not sufficient to pay the creditors. So the Pilgrims passed laws that were ahead of their time. They decided that if a man left an estate and he was insolvent, then the governor and the assistants would get together and they would set aside a subsistence for the widow, and they would also set up maintenance for the children. Now, what happened to the widows? Well, the first is that Francis Eaton's widow, Christian Penn, actually married Francis Billington. So she did not starve. She moved in with Francis Billington, and they had 9 more children, and there are millions of descendants today. But in the case of Peter Brown's widow, he actually had 2 children from an earlier marriage, and the governor and the assistants decided to place Mary and Priscilla with other families to raise. And then they set aside a subsistence for the widow and her 2 children, including the one that had just been born in the cradle. And these kinds of changes were incredible. They even went farther by protecting widows. They said that men could not cut out their widows and children out of their estate. They provided that each widow would get 1/3 of all the lands for her life, and then she would get half of all the personal property, the movables, like the bed and the candlesticks. 1/2 would be hers forever, and she could dispose of it the way she wanted. That's why Mary Chilton had a will and had silver cups and silver bowls to pass on to her heirs. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope you've learned a little bit about the material culture of the Pilgrims, but more important, some of the compassion and the common sense that have inspired American law today. Thank you, and see you next time.